even at that even at that incredible scale, it is only the 20th largest palace in the world. So that could be like a whole other art talk, the world's largest palaces. I love this little rendering of the gardens behind the palace. So here we've been looking at the front of the palace over here. This is essentially the extensive backyard that we're looking at. Now, I was just referencing square footage. This is actually the world's largest royal domain, because those gardens, when you encapsulate all of them with the palace itself, take up over 2,000 acres of land. And the way these gardens were planted and planned really is just remarkable. If you've ever been to Versailles, you might remember that the gardens that are closest to the palace itself are these sort of strict French garden style green spaces. They are rigid and like rigidly maintained. They're very regimented spaces. But as you move further and further away from the palace itself, it gives itself over to more rustic and more forest-like garden settings. And there are, I think, around 50 different fountains throughout this space. And then the Grand Canal itself, which is, I believe, about a mile long here and over 200 feet wide. So it can take the better part of a day to just walk all the way around this fountain. I learned that firsthand when I was in college. So all of this is done, you know, without the benefit of heavy machinery. All of this land is maintained and moved without excavators or bulldozers. This was really a massive earthworks project. And of course, it remains there today. We're going to be talking about some of these buildings over here in just a little while as well. Now let's turn our attention to the visual culture of what Versailles really looked like in this era of the late 1700s to the late 1700s. This is a period of art that's called the Rococo, and it is known for being it has this kind of light and airiness about it. There's usually a sense of frivolity when it comes to a lot of the images of the Rococo, and oftentimes it depicts the lives and sometimes the love lives of the rich, of the powerful. And so we'll start off over here with this image on the left, which dates to about 1700. This is a portrait of Louis the 14th at age 63. Now we can see him here depicted as an absolute monarch. This is an image of total power and domination. We have this kind of fleur-de-lis style pattern on this expansive robe that flows over his elbow and his shoulder here. He's got this massive wig on, the crown, the scepter, the sword, the mild look of relative disdain as he looks down his nose at us. And this is a very large painting as well. It's about 10.5 feet high. And so an image like this could certainly make an impression. The detail that I always love here, though, is that he's wearing high-heeled shoes. I think he had maybe he was compensating for something, shall we say. And he's also standing in like a perfect fifth position. So the lightness and the airiness and the frivolity of the Rococo, you can certainly associate with ballet, because this king loved ballet himself. So we see this all kind of coming together in Hyacinthe Rigaud's incredible large painting of the king over here. But another emblematic image of the Rococo, and I feel like we're almost peeking into the gardens of Versailles when we look at this image over here by the French artist Fragonard, the famous picture, The Swing, from 1767. This is in the Wallace collection in London, incidentally. And so we see this woman in this beautiful peach-colored dress that it looks as though it's been sort of inflated with air as she's swinging through the air. And she is kicking off her shoe and sort of creating a view up her skirt for her lover, who is hiding down here in this little flower bush below. Her shoe is flying towards this little cupid that seems to kind of, a sculpture of a cupid that seems to be sort of admonishing her to behave. And she is throwing caution to the wind and essentially flirting with this young man in front of her, even though there's an older man here behind her who is doing all of the pushing and pulling for the swinging. So it's this kind kind of beautiful imagined space. It's this theme of love, in this case maybe a risque love, and it's really about the lives of the rich and the powerful. This does not certainly reflect the lives of the average French person at this time. So we've got a good idea of power, of Rococo. I now want to introduce you to, let me make sure I get this relationship right, Louis XIV's great grandson. This is Louis XVI, and it's his reign that begins in 1774 when he is just 19 years old. So he is coming into power really not too long before the French Revolution comes underway. Now, you can see that a lot translates visually. Not a lot has changed since the beginning of the century. We still have similar robes, scepter, a crown, and showing off the legs. There's this sense of confidence here. But unfortunately for Louis XVI, he doubted his own abilities, and the country was facing a myriad of problems, and he didn't really think that he was necessarily the best person to meet those challenges. In particular, the country was deeply in debt. You wouldn't necessarily know it by looking at the costume here. And there was this growing resentment against the monarchy that we will see rises and rises and rises and really lasts until the end of the century. All right, so I want to introduce you to an important artist, one of really the most important artists from this era. And this is a self-portrait by the artist Elisabeth Vigee Le Brun. It was painted in 1782. She was born in 1755. So she's about 27 years old here. There's a directness, I think a really endearing directness, a confidence here. She, as a young woman, is showing us that she's an artist and that she is a highly capable, talented artist that can create these a beautiful image that has this wonderful immediacy to it. Don't you feel like you know her, like you might want to know her, that you might want to be friends with her? Now, she was largely self-taught, but she was working as a professional painter by the time she was 14 years old. And she had this incredible, the education that she did have was really an education in the art of conversation, so that it would help her essentially land a husband. But she took that art of conversation to enhance her her abilities working with patrons. And so she had this incredible talent in terms of creating beautiful portraits of people who also seem as at ease with themselves as she seems with herself. So she's using this charm, her beauty, this social savviness to really launch a career. And you can see from these portraits that she's creating around the same time, again, these would have been the rich, the aristocratic, that Vigee Le Brun herself is a little bit of a trendsetter. These women are wearing hats that are similar to hers. They're wearing outfits that are similar to hers. Perhaps she was just a part of an ongoing trend, but I can't help but feel like they may in fact be wearing some of her clothes in some of these portraits. I think she had a certain way about her that people were drawn to. Now, sometimes she would run into clients that became so dazzled by her that they would fall in love with her essentially as she was painting their portraits. And here's a fun little fact. If she felt like that was happening, she would tell her subject, her model, can you look up and off into the distance? Just like, let's stop making direct eye contact so you don't fall any more deeper in love with me. So whenever you see a portrait of a man painted by Vigee Le Brun and he's looking off to the side, he was probably coming on a little too strong. So Vigee Le Brun is making a great living for herself. And then through a connection with one of these rich patrons of her, she is introduced to the Queen of France, Marie Antoinette herself. And in the years leading up to the revolution, Vigee Le Brun begins working as essentially the unofficial / official portrait painter to Marie Antoinette. And over the years, she creates 30 different portraits of her. The two women were actually born in the same year. That's probably where their similarities ended, because it's hard to imagine what Marie Antoinette's life was actually like. This painting falls in line. This is an early painting by Vigee Le Brun, but it really falls in line with what previous portraits of the Queen had really looked like. She seems distant, aloof. Her focus is really, our focus in this picture is really on her wealth and her power. We can see the crown over here, a sculpture of her husband up above, and her gaze is up and off to the side. And I mean, the dress here is really just to telegraph just how impressive her status is. Although I did see a really funny meme about this painting not too long ago, where the joke was essentially that she was at a party and she's smuggling a widescreen TV out of the party. So whenever you see anybody in a skirt this wide, be suspicious. So, so one of the things that Vigee Le Brun does very well early on in working with Marie Antoinette is that she captures her features faithfully, but she tends to soften them. Marie Antoinette was part of the Habsburg family line, a notoriously inbred family with a prominent lantern jaw. So we see a little bit of that too. And she also had very large kind of bulging eyes. And so, so she treats that sort of fairly but nicely in this painting. And we'll see as the relationship grows, Vigee Le Brun begins sort of giving Marie Antoinette like an 18th century virtual makeover. She's glowing her up. So before long, she is actually painting Marie Antoinette, who we see over here in the portrait on the left. Much in the same guise as her self-portrait that we've already seen. So this is a portrait of Marie Antoinette from 1783. So the same decade as the French Revolution. And we're going to see how an image like this and really what it's associated with is part of the reason that Marie Antoinette gets into such hot water. But she is, what we see here is she's wearing a very, very simple white dress. It's almost like a simple peasant dress in some ways. I mean, a straw hat, very similar to the straw hat that Vigee Le Brun was wearing, and she's arranging flowers. Now, the French were not used to seeing their monarchs in such humble attire. They were much more used to symbols of absolute power here. And Marie Antoinette, who had, been a monarch for quite some time at this point, she was pushing against this role in interesting ways, pushing against the constraints of her life in interesting ways. So here we are looking at the Palace Versailles again in a map. This is the building itself. These are the expansive gardens out the back, the huge canal. And way off here on the side, as far away from that palace as you can imagine, there's a little hamlet here. This was a hamlet built for Marie Antoinette. It was a little rustic village that was a functioning farm with Norman-style cottages. And this was created for her exclusive use. It still exists there today, created between 1783 and 86. And it was like a place for her to experience rural life. It was used as like a teaching space for her children, but she did have her own spaces there as well. So here's just another view of it. It's this lovely imagined rustic village, but you can imagine if you were a poor person starving in the middle of Paris and you heard that the very rich and wealthy queen was sort of playing at being poor, that might ruffle a few feathers. So within the space of a few years, Vigee Le Brun had to go back and repaint, create a new painting of Marie Antoinette, not with the simple dress of, not quite a peasant here, but a humble dress over here, and replace it with something that was much more opulent, fitting her station in life. And something like this would have been much better received by the French public. So there was an interesting push-pull. There's this rising hatred against the monarchy, really, but they still wanted their monarchs to act a particular way. And Vigee Le Brun plays a specific role in the life of Marie Antoinette, sort of like a marketing campaign to help rehab the Queen's image. And so she sort of carefully toes the line in understanding how the Queen should be presented publicly. So here we're looking at a portrait of the Queen from 1787. It's a state portrait with the Queen and her 3 surviving children. So this black cloth over the bassinet here represents the fact that a fourth child has passed away. And the queen is looking elegant. She's in like this red velvet dress. So it's not too simple, but it's not quite so over the top as some of those unbelievably wide dresses that we saw before. She is a mother here, and she is a mother to the whole country in a picture like this. We've come a long way from smuggling widescreen TVs over here and resting your hand knowingly on a globe as though there's this hint of world power underneath it. So interestingly, Vigee Le Brun is appropriating her own sort of gestures of love and affection that she used in another self-portrait with her own daughter, and incorporating that into the Queen's portrait over here to really make her seem like somebody who's a mom, somebody who is connected with her children. So once again, this is yet another self-portrait by the artist Vigee Le Brun, affectionately embracing her daughter over here. So we'll end our look at Vigee Le Brun with one last self-portrait, because as the tide begins to turn against the Queen here, Vigee Le Brun goes into a self-imposed exile. She gets out of town. She actually gets out of the country, and she spends the next 12 years in exile, but working the whole time, painting monarchs and the aristocracy all over Europe and in Russia as well. The image that we're looking at is a self-portrait from 1790, and it was commissioned by the Medici family for the Uffizi Gallery. They just wanted self-portraits by preeminent artists of the day. And so Vigee Le Brun is once again looking out at us confidently. We can see that she's aged some since that portrait from when she was in her 20s, but there's wonderful experience here, and she's even showing us her work at the easel. We could probably safely bet that this is a portrait of Marie Antoinette once again, because those portraits of the Queen really helped to make her career. Now, despite how unpopular the Queen herself was. So let's turn our attention to what prompted Vigee Le Brun to leave town, what prompted that escape. This is our segue to revolution. And we're going to look at some of the philosophical underpinnings here before we get to some of the bloody results. Now, I have two images on the screen. We have The Social Contract by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then a political cartoon over here on the right. So with The Social Contract and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we have this idea that, that people, Rousseau and others, are beginning to question the divine right of kings, the very notion that God has picked certain people, certain family line to rule everybody else. This is where we begin to see the notion of equality under the law, the idea of natural rights. So as these sorts of concepts are bubbling up, there begins to be sort of real life changes and reactions in Paris and in the surrounds. So in this cartoon over here, we're seeing what's called the Third Estate, carrying the First Estate, which is the clergy, and the Second Estate, which is the nobility. And of course, the Third Estate here is essentially the workers. So the workers, who represented nearly everyone, are doing the hardest, heaviest work, and part of that is made harder by the fact that these other groups get a free ride on their back. So this is creating some real, I guess the tensions between these classes are really sort of coming to a head. All right, so everybody has heard of the storming of the Bastille, and this is really sort of the catalyst for the French Revolution itself. So this is one artist's imagined rendering of this particular event. And I think we just had like the 233rd anniversary of the storming of Bastille. So it's July 1789, and the Bastille, which had been an armory and a prison, really remained the symbol right in Paris of royal tyranny. And so, one day there's about 1,000 people outside, and they're ready to storm inside and release the prisoners inside this prison. when all was said and done, there were only 7 captives inside. So I mean, a lot of this was like more symbolic than anything else. But they ended up going into this prison and taking out the prisoners, releasing the prisoners, and then taking the guards and the people that were responsible for the Bastille, taking them into their custody. Now, Thomas Jefferson was actually in Paris on this day. He recounted the whole event in a letter. Believe it or not, the key to the Bastille was given to George Washington in 1790 from Lafayette. And he had it displayed prominently when he was in power. And then when he left the presidency, he brought this 1-pound key all the way back to Mount Vernon with him. And if you've ever been to Mount Vernon, the key to the Bastille is hanging up there in the walls. Now, it wasn't without blood. It wasn't without violence, because the guards that they took out of the Bastille, some were brutalized, some were beheaded. These are revolutionaries. These are agitators who are walking around with those severed heads on pikes over here. So we're already seeing from the get-go that there's a sort of bloodlust that is caught up in the political tumult of the time. And of course, that introduces us to the concept of the guillotine. The guillotine is named after this man over here whose name was Joseph Ignace Guillot. It's an anonymous portrait, but he presented this kind of Enlightenment idea of a way to execute people that would be equal for all. So if you're going to execute a king or a commoner, everybody would have the same ending, and it would minimize suffering, and it would be quick and it would be efficient. And of course, it becomes all the rage. There were what we're looking at over here on the right are actually a pair of guillotine earrings. So we can see the blade here and the head of the king that has been severed. In addition to this, guillotines just become a part of like popular culture in this really sort of strange and unexpected way. There's like toys and cutting boards and dinner plates that are ornamented with guillotines at the time. It was something that people were celebrating in a strange and unexpected way, which brings us to the death of the king. Of course, we come to a point in the French Revolution where the king is brought to the guillotine in the Place de la Concorde, right in the center of Paris. In this case, he is facing a pedestal where the statue of his grandfather had previously stood. So we were introduced to the king in this symbol of absolute power, and then he is his head is being presented to the crowds that have assembled to see and ensure his death here. So he met a bloody end, as did his wife, Marie Antoinette. This is like a cartoon that was made after the fact that shows her death by guillotine as well. So we definitely have this sense that that there's a huge political shift, and that there is essentially zero tolerance for the ways of the past. So over the course of the next year or so, during the Reign of Terror, close to 17,000 people in Paris and in the surrounds were executed by guillotine. So there was a very swift sense of justice, and to me, a pretty terrifying sense of what justice should look like. So we begin to see a huge shift in the visual vocabulary of the times. Over-the-top depictions of kings, these frivolous scenes of love and lust that we associate with the Rococo, they are gone. And we begin to see images of Enlightenment thought. So this is a portrait of Diderot from 1767, so just before the revolution, but we see some of the revolutionary concepts here, because the style that is coming to be representative of this period is called neoclassicism. And neoclassicism relates back to Enlightenment thinking, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and thinking of the classical past, references to the classical past. But in this case, Diderot was an Enlightenment philosopher who wrote specifically about how art should uplift people morally. You shouldn't advocate vice or anything that's frivolous in artwork. So he would have had a huge slash through a painting just like this one. Art was there to remind people of really what was important and virtuous in this world. So, so he's a good segue to the leading artist of this period, whose name was Jacques-Louis David, and this is a self-portrait of the artist here. Now, we've already seen Vigee Le Brun, who was young and beautiful and a go-getter and could, have a great conversation with any one of her clients. In so many ways, David was very different. Whereas she was beautiful and charming, he was actually disfigured. It's a little bit hard to see it over here, but he's got a huge scar on the side of his face from a sword fight and a benign tumor that really impacted the way he spoke. So I think he was a little bit inhibited in how he acted with others. Now, Vigee Le Brun had been motivated and she'd been strategic about her career. Jacques-Louis David could be a little bit of a baby sometimes. He really wanted a particular prize when he was in art school. He wanted a prize for his work. And when he didn't get it, he went on a hunger strike. So as somebody with a toddler, I can say that that is toddler behavior to the extreme. But he goes on to really be the voice of his generation. And he changes the way people engage with the arts, changes the way art represents the world and politics in particular. So we have Vigee Le Brun's portrait of Marie Antoinette over here on the left. This is an incredible portrait by Jacques-Louis David. Most of you have probably seen it in person in real life because it's at the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's about 8.5 feet tall, so it really makes an impression. This is a portrait of, let me make sure I'm saying this right, Monsieur and Madame Lavoisier. Now, what we're looking at here is not an image of an aristocrat who is, not a frivolous scene of love here, but instead we are looking at a thinker, we are looking at a scientist. In fact, he had been doing experiments on gunpowder, which got him into hot water with the revolutionaries because they thought, they knew that he had gotten gunpowder out of the Bastille leading up to the storming of the Bastille. So that actually resulted in him being beheaded. So, so despite his untimely end, we do see that Jacques-Louis David is approaching his subjects in a slightly different way, but his major paintings, some of them, really don't seem at first glance to have anything to do with the French Revolution. But like Diderot said, he was painting images that were to convey morals, that were to teach lessons. And because this is the neoclassicism, the new classicism, he was focusing on the classical past in order to tell those lessons. So this is probably the greatest neoclassical painting of all time. It's called The Oath of the Horatii, or the Horatii, from 1784. This is at the Louvre. It's a huge painting, approximately 10 feet high by 14 feet wide. And what we're seeing is this kind of virtuous behavior that Diderot would have loved. And I'll sum up the story for you very quickly. Essentially, Rome was at war with another city-state, and instead of sending all of their young men into battle, they decide to just send 3 guys from each side. And so in this moment, these 3 brothers are pledging or swearing to their father that they will be the 3 men representing their side. It's a heroic moment, but most importantly, it is patriotic. And that's what would have been really the important moral to be conveyed at this particular point in French history. So there is a striking realism to the scene. My eyes always go to these very muscular legs of these men, and you can see the veins pulsating in the muscles. It's really impressive, but the whole thing is framed by these 3 Roman arches with the columns in the background. It's all laid out very logically. It's a rational space here in order to convey this important message. We probably don't have time today to get into all of the the gender politics in this image, but suffice it to say, the women don't really play an important role in this particular composition. We can see that Jacques-Louis David is referencing the classical past once again with this image here, which is called "The Lictors Bringing to Brutus the Bodies of His Son." This is from 1789. So this is like right on the cusp of the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. And this is another image that is carefully picked essentially to tell the story of service and dedication to the state. So the subject here is Brutus, of course, who's the founder of the Roman Republic. And here he is contemplating the fate of his dead sons. Now, his sons had conspired to overthrow the Republic, to try and restore the monarchy. And it's really up to Brutus who decides that their actions would condemn them to death. So here he is pondering the fact that his children are now gone, and it was by his decision. Notice how he seems reflective in his face and with this pose of his hand, but my eyes always go to his toes, and I sort of get this sense that the lower part of his body is just like really tight and all wound up here. And of course, the women here are responding emotionally and sort of irrationally compared to Brutus, at least. But all of these images from the classical past are there to tell the modern French person just how to act and feel. Now, Jacques-Louis David did do another image here that had a huge impact, or that was a reflection, I should say, really, on modern politics. And it's called "The Oath of the Tennis Court." I love this image. It's an unfinished work of art. And it's a really important scene in the French Revolution. It dates to 1792. And it was an important moment when the three estates here, the clergy, the aristocracy, and the third estate, the workers, were all supposed to sort of get together and discuss what was happening in terms of politics. And the clergy and the aristocracy shut out the third estate. They were barred from entering this discussion. So they all gathered together instead in this indoor tennis court, and they pledged to each other and themselves that they essentially wouldn't disband until they came up with their new representational constitution. This was the moment where they said, we're going to create our own government. And so Jacques-Louis David depicts this in such a powerful way. It's everybody with their hand up in the air, swearing this oath. There's all sorts of this kind of emotional drama in this moment as everybody is coming together. It's a little bit of shades of the oath of the Herati over here, with the arms coming up in this patriotic pledge. And you can see people, hanging off of, different parts of the building, and all of these bodies telegraphing, communicating to us just how important this event is. Now, that tennis court still stands today, and here is a version of Jacques-Louis David's work on that far wall there. So the last work from the Revolution that I wanted to share with you, this is also Jacques-Louis David, and it's probably one of the most famous images from the French Revolution. It's another image that is about contemporary politics and not a look back at the neoclassical past. This is called "The Death of Marat" from 1793. Now, we are looking at a journalist here who is really a propaganda journalist, and he was on the side of Jacques-Louis David and other revolutionaries. He was a propagandist who could really rile people up. And he famously had this horrible skin condition, which was caused a lot of itchiness and discomfort. So he would oftentimes sit in a tub and write in his tub. So he caused the death of about 1,000 people in the space of about a week in something called the September Massacres. And one day, in response to that, a woman named Charlotte Corday gained access to Marat's apartment, went into his space and stabbed him. And she was almost immediately apprehended. and sentenced to death by guillotine. Now, this has been such a celebrated image because of, well, first of all, Jacques-Louis David's use of space here, that half of the image is just this almost monochromatic background, how he's elegantly treated the body here. A lot of art historians connect the death of Marat to Michelangelo's iconic image of the death of Christ in the Pietà from the 1500s or late 1400s over here. Notice the elongated arm in both of them. I mean, Marat's body almost looks like a marble sculpture in some ways. And he has really idealized the face of Marat here, made him look almost semi-divine. We can see in this other rendering that, that Marat wasn't necessarily the most handsome man in the world, but Jacques-Louis David knows that in order to make really good propaganda visually, that you have to have a certain beauty to convey a message here. Now, just for fun, I wanted to kind of zoom in on the note here that references Charlotte Corday, and I also wanted to show you quickly how artists over the years have depicted the same scene, the same moment. This is a work by another French artist from like the 1860s, where you can see Charlotte Corday. She's done the deed and she's rushing out the door. Edvard Munch in the late 1800s does his own version of Corday and Marat. And in this case, I think he's just painted some nudes and has attached to a story to it. This famous painting is even sometimes referenced in film. If you've ever seen the movie about Schmidt with Jack Nicholson, they visually quote the movie as well. The last work from Jacques-Louis David that we're going to see in this section here that relates to politics is this absolutely incredible sketch that he created of Marie Antoinette on the way to the guillotine. This grim-faced expression, this woman brought down from the pedestal on which she lived through most of her life, is just so incredibly powerful to me. She is a world away from the unbelievable dresses and hats and feathers and flowers that we saw in the paintings from Elisabeth Vigee Le Brun. This is the grimmest moment that you could ever possibly imagine, and its immediacy is so striking to me. So what happens with the French Revolution is that there's like a counter-revolution, and then all the revolutionaries start getting guillotined as well. And Jacques-Louis David, narrowly escaped the guillotine himself. Instead, he was imprisoned with several other radicals for his role in the Reign of Terror. And he created this self-portrait actually while he was in prison. Now, his wife, who had been a royalist, divorces him, and in part because David said he had voted for the death of the king during this period of revolution. So what happens next for him? Well, things change politically once again, and remarkably, Jacques-Louis David kind of rolls with it. And here's this man who is against monarchy, against absolute power. Napoleon Bonaparte comes into power, he's rising in power. And David makes the savvy professional choice to associate himself with Napoleon. Now we are looking at two depictions of Napoleon by David, this unfinished one over here, which I think is just another really kind of remarkably immediate image, as well as this widely reproduced image of Napoleon crossing the Alps, created in 1805. Now, what's really fun to think about is that this was more propaganda, essentially. This was a collaboration between Napoleon and David to show Napoleon in the best possible light. Napoleon didn't lead his troops through the Alps. Instead, he followed them days later. He wasn't riding a horse, he traveled by mule. There was none of the heroism that we see in this picture in real life. And certainly Jacques-Louis David made him look much more heroic than Napoleon probably was in his actual life. He even associates him with great generals of the past by carving their names into the stone over here. So he solidifies his relationship with Napoleon by painting this huge image of Napoleon's coronation. This dates to about 1807. The painting is 33 feet wide. The figures in this painting are roughly life-size. This is one of the largest paintings at the Louvre. In this moment of this scene of coronation, it's actually Napoleon standing above Josephine, his wife, with a crown for her. She's kneeling on this pillow, and it's, you know, their brothers and sisters and other dignitaries, actually, most importantly, dignitaries from other countries that have been invited to see this display of unbelievable wealth and power in this moment so that they could then go home and spread the word. Now, Jacques-Louis David, if I'm remembering correctly, actually portrays himself up here sketching the entire event as it unfolds. And this is Napoleon's mother in this place of honor to watch her son. When Napoleon saw this picture for the first time, he said, "It is not a painting. There are people walking in this picture. Life is everywhere. David, I salute you. You have made me a French knight." So getting in good with Napoleon, here's just a detail of Napoleon's face and this golden laurel crown that he is wearing here. Getting in good with Napoleon, at least for a short time, is a great thing for his career. Now, I want to introduce you to one last leading French artist whose name is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And we see his self-portrait here at the age of 24. And this was painted in 1804. He was really too young to be a revolutionary. So he's kind of coming of age at a period just after all of this upheaval. But he's, in terms of the history of French painting, just as important as Vigee Le Brun and David. So he was sort of a protege to Jacques-Louis David, and was working in the same style of neoclassicism, although it made him seem a little bit out of date, a little bit anachronistic that he was still working in this neoclassical style by the early 1800s. So he aspired to be like David, to paint important historical paintings, but for the most part, he's really known for his portraits of the, not of Napoleon really, but of the aristocracy. This is one important portrait that he did of Napoleon. This was Napoleon as first consul. This is from 1804, the same year as his self-portrait. And it's a rather understated depiction of Napoleon. He looks like a statesman. He's got that classic stately pose with the hand tucked into the jacket up here, and he's pointing to papers. He's showing his knowledge and respect for the law. But it's really when Napoleon becomes emperor that Ingres' artistic talents are put to best use, shall I say. This picture of Napoleon on his imperial throne from just 2 years later, painted by Ingres once again, really shows the incredible scope of Ingres' talent, his ability to render the real world in his works, and also the incredible power that Napoleon held at this point as well. I mean, I had the pleasure of seeing this work in person years ago, and it absolutely knocked my socks off. This is a painting where you feel like you can step up on this step here that is covered in a carpet that has a little eagle here, and that you could reach out and hold all of the elements of this picture, the scepters, the gold thread in this red velvet cloak that's ermine lined. Everything about this is remarkable in its realism, but it's also pretty unusual in terms of its rigid frontality here. Ingres is kind of reaching back into much earlier models in terms of images of power. And so actually the French public didn't really like this depiction of Napoleon so much. It's sort of similar to what we saw with Vigee Le Brun and Marie Antoinette. It wasn't, they didn't so much have a problem with the image of power on display, but they just didn't like how it was rendered by the artist. So both of them sort of have this a little bit of a PR problem. Now, like I said, when it came to this artist Ingres, he only had a few shots at painting Napoleon, and then he basically made a career out of painting these absolutely remarkable portraits of the French aristocracy. His ability to render materials of the physical world are really just so breathtaking to me. I mean, the dresses are remarkable, the poses, the sense of expression, the conveyance of emotion here is just, it's unparalleled. I get so excited looking at paintings by Ingres, but we're going to wrap up our little introduction to the history of the visuals of the French Revolution by just sort of seeing what happens for Napoleon. Now, we know that as he was sort of up and coming, his springboard to political power was that he was leading military expeditions. This is a famous painting of Napoleon facing the Sphinx here. This was painted in the 1880s by the artist Gérôme. Napoleon also went into exile later on. He spends his final days here. He's on St. Helena. And I love that he's wearing like the exact same military garb, but now in this case, just kind of looking longingly off over the water. So Napoleon's rise and fall is documented by artists of his day. And then even after his death at the age of 51, we have artists still thinking about Napoleon and his impact, and even the impact of the visual propaganda around him. So this is a painting that was created decades after Napoleon's death. And it's a realist version of Napoleon crossing the Alps here. Here we can see the mule that he traveled on, the unheroic circumstances and conditions, and how I just love how deflated he looks in comparison to the Jacques-Louis David version here. He looks like a real man, and he looks like he's suffering under these conditions and not necessarily celebrating, as we see over here. So we're just going to wrap things up by heading back to Versailles one last time, tie things up with a little bow here, because Napoleon did spend some time at Versailles when he was emperor, but he started to realize very quickly that the upkeep for this place was just overwhelming, financially draining. So he and his family basically moved out of the palace, and they were living in some of the smaller palaces over here by that hamlet that Marie Antoinette had owned. And instead of investing money really in the palace, he decides to try and conquer the rest of Europe, right? Which would, of course, be his downfall. So maybe if he had just spent more time inside Versailles, the course of European history would have been a little different. So shortly after Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo in 1850, we have the monarchy being restored. So we go from King Louis XVI, eventually to Napoleon, and then back to the monarchy. This is King Louis the 16th's brother. This let me make sure I get this right. This is Louis Philippe, and he was still related to the monarchy, and incidentally, he was married to Marie Antoinette's niece. And so talk about politics making strange bedfellows. His own father had a hand in Marie Antoinette's execution. So he was actually the fifth cousin to the king, to the previous king. Now, Louis Philippe takes a real interest in Versailles. And I should mention just this last image over here on the right. He is an actual photograph of the last monarch of France, that he was alive so late into history that you could actually have a photograph of him. It is like remarkable to me. So he decides to turn Versailles into a museum, turn it over to the people of France. Here he is in a painting where he's dedicating a gallery that's filled with these battle scenes. So by his order, the prince's apartments are destroyed, everything's replaced with portrait galleries, and he opens it up to the people of France to unite the people of France. Today, the Museum Versailles holds more than 6,000 paintings and 3,000 sculptures, and it's one of the richest sources of French history. So we'll finish up today with just the legacy. What does all of this mean? Well, it means, for the French at least, that that violence entered into political discourse. That revolution became how political change was made. So for decades into the 1800s, there were multiple revolutions in France. And this iconic image of the barricades here and liberty leading the people is probably the best known image of the French Revolution, but it wasn't the specific revolution that we were looking at today. But this idea of an armed uprising from the people is one that continued on like I said, well into the middle of the century. And what would frequently happen was these like narrow medieval streets of France or of Paris were barricaded off so that soldiers couldn't get through them, and the revolutionaries could then attack the military from that vantage point. And so what we'll see in towards the end of the 19th century is this entire redesign of the city of Paris by a man by the name of Haussmann, who creates these grand boulevards that really can't be barricaded. And these are the grand boulevards that we all love promenading down when we go and visit Paris. These are the boulevards that the Impressionist artists of the later half of the century loved to paint. This is an image by the French Impressionist Caillebotte. So literally the landscape of Paris dramatically changes because of the way that people were engaging with politics in the first half of the 1800s. Another part of the legacy of the French Revolution is the guillotine. And I love this meme, I love this factoid. France was still executing people by guillotine when the first Star Wars movie came out. That was the last time, and it was a little bit of an outlier. They have not done it since. And then finally, we have this notion that Marie Antoinette's reputation has been sort of rehabbed in recent years too. There was a 2006 film and book, and they gave much more sympathetic versions of the life of the Queen. This movie, I think it's a Sofia Coppola movie, was actually really enjoyable, at least for me, if you like that sort of thing. In the years since, believe it or not, the French government is still spending money to restore Versailles because during the revolutions, I mean, gates had been pulled down, the place had been ransacked. And so just recently, these golden gates outside of Versailles were reinstalled. They're worth about $8 million alone right there, just to make the palace whole again, really. And we love it, don't we? This is why millions of people flock to Versailles every year. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And here we see crowds in the famous Hall of Mirrors. And it's amazing to think that this place is filled not with rioters these days, but with tourists like this. So we'll wrap up with just this quick overview that, you know, the events of this tumultuous period and our understanding of them have been dramatically shaped by the artists that we looked at today. They captured the power and in some cases the heartbreak, the despair, and their works were these incredible testaments to what was happening in these extremely tumultuous political times. So with stunning detail and awe-inspiring talent, they portray lessons that still resonate today. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you might have about the French Revolution and the artists we looked at today.
Thank you, Jane. This has been, as always, certainly a wonderful experience to have you talking about any particular topic about art. Several different laudatory comments about what a great program it's been, how people saying love learning about the artist personalities, as well as seeing these beautiful paintings. Thank you so much. Especially love the portraits. Gorgeous. We've asked for some questions. I don't see too many questions here. We can give people a little bit of time, either questions or comments for Jane.
Oh yeah, and Marnie asked you if I could talk a little bit about the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which is on Sunday, November 6th.
That'll be the next installment of the European Art Series.
The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood program, I think, is like an unexpected delight for so many. I'm just trying to go back to Ingres for a second because those paintings are just such knockouts. There we go. Okay, so the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood really starts up around the mid-1800s in England. And it's these men that become obsessed really with capturing minute detail in their paintings and referencing the classical past, referencing literary history. They have very high-minded ideals for what their art should look like. But in the end, what we can engage with visually are just these stunning pictures. There's a lot of images of like knights and heroines. They really loved redheaded women, so they really stand out in this program too. And then it's a style that I think a lot of people don't realize lasted well into the 20th century. And there are even some women who participated in the movement and made some really stunning contributions too.
Interesting. There's a question that asks, did they grow vegetables in the gardens to feed people?
Oh, that's a good question, Carol. That aspect of the history of the gardens, I am not certain of. But I don't think that was, maybe people who lived in the palace, I wonder, maybe yes, but certainly not beyond that. As I'm remembering it, I don't really recall ever learning about that aspect, but I could be wrong. That's a really good question. Usually it's about, like, whenever I'm reading up and refreshing my memory about the gardens of Versailles, it's really about the opulence of it. I mean, just thinking about the engineering feat of having like 50 different fountains going in one garden, when you don't even really have the indoor plumbing nailed down is pretty amazing to me. So I practically speaking, it seems like they probably would have had to, but I don't know the logistics there.
Possible other program, I'm just thinking of it, is the artwork of Versailles. That could be, a 6-month series. If you, would you say 5 or 6,000 pieces of art there? Yeah.
I mean, it would just be one stuffy looking rich person after another. Carol asked a very practical question too of how did these women use bathrooms with these dresses? That's a really good question. All I can picture is like, modern brides these days, they have to go to the bathroom with all their bridesmaids so they can hold the dresses for them. But who knows? I mean, I'm sure there's like a whole architecture underneath these dresses that still mystifies me.
I don't think they did a lot of drinking water, carrying their water bottles back then.
Nobody was hydrated.
Nobody was hydrating, yeah. Another question that comes through, is there a significance to some of the portraits showing just one leg exposed by the subject?
I'm wondering if she's thinking about like those portraits of the kings. Oh, maybe that one. I'm not sure. It's a very good question, but I'm not sure if there's any particular significance here. That's really interesting. And I mean, we saw that with the kings too. I think these are pretty standard poses. Even when we get up to like John Singleton Copley in America, I mean, he's doing very similar compositions with his work. I'm not sure what the leg means, maybe other than like that there's a gracefulness to this leg. I mean, it almost seems like he's pointing his toe. So I wonder if it's a way to kind of communicate some athleticism or some grace there, but that's just a guess. I really don't know, but it's a great attention to detail that you asked the question. Oh yeah, and then I see somebody asked, how do you spell the name of the female portraitist? Did she have a friendship with Marie Antoinette? Her name is Vigee Le Brun. I'm just typing this in here. Elisabeth Vigee Le Brun. And from what I have seen, I don't necessarily get the sense that it was a friendship. It was probably, I'm hoping for Vigee Le Brun's sake, a pleasant working relationship, because I sort of failed to really hit this point, but she definitely tends to make the queen look better and better as time goes on. And I think it was probably a result of, some collaboration, some input from the queen, and maybe an affection for the queen too, who knows? But it's interesting to think that over time, she tends to flatter the queen more and more. I think that this is a more attractive looking version of the queen than maybe that first portrait that we saw with the really big dress over here. So who knows? But from what I've seen, it's not like they became besties in the process, unfortunately. That would have been interesting.
Any other questions? Someone asks about registering. Yes, you need to register for each of the sessions individually. There's a number of reasons why for that, which I won't get into, but each particular part of the series has its own registration. So yes, and this will be available on the Rockport Library's YouTube page, probably the end of the week. And for all those who are interested, again, the link for the next program is in the chat, but certainly I can send that out when I send the link to the program. So somebody asked if there's one on Easter Sunday. I can't remember the dates, but I don't think there's one on Easter Sunday, but I may be wrong. If it is on Easter Sunday, we did not plan it to be Easter Sunday, and we'll probably have to look into fixing that, because people will be searching for their eggs diligently rather than paying attention to Jane. And I think Jane's kids will probably be looking for Easter eggs this year too. So I'll thank everybody for joining and wish everybody a great remainder of the day and enjoying this gorgeous fall weather. Thank you, Jane, as always, and Marnie for also co-hosting with us. And I'll wish everybody a great rest of the Sunday and enjoy. Thanks again, Jane.
Everyone, bye.